Chapter 17. Sharing is Caring. Ah, Master Ben, there you are. Ben strode into the arena armed with his wits and a razor-sharp glare. Volkara? He deadpanned. The master healer perched her hands on her notepad as the door slid shut behind him. Taking his time, Ben sat and crossed one leg over the other. I was unaware we were on first-name terms, the healer smiled. It seemed a logical next step in our increasingly close relationship, what with you calling me here so that you may rifle through my innermost privacies, a marauding exciser of your horrid calling. Consciously or unconsciously, Ben was channeling his inner counselor. Elbows splayed authoritatively on the armrests, boots and eyebrows angled just so in authority, all in a cutting figure most Jedi had known to fear and respect. Fortunately or unfortunately, Volkara had never known Ben as a counselor. She ticked an eyebrow and spun her stylus in an aggravated staccato. I seem to recall you thanking me for my services not all that long ago. I didn't know you then. You recognized me while hardly lucid, she countered. Ben pursed his lips. I didn't know you well then. There will be no rifling, Master Kenobi. Your fears are unfounded. I'm not afraid. I'm annoyed. You're acting like a child. Some might say that I am still a child, from a certain point of view. A very particular point of view, one which I will not indulge. Now, she fixed him with a stern look that was, despite the parentless childhoods of both these parties, unmistakably maternal. I've reserved this room for a full hour, and you will not be leaving until that hour is up. You can continue this puerile rant, or you can share in civil conversation. Either way, you will be here until 14th hour, and you will return to this very spot for another hour in 2 weeks' time. Be stubborn and I can make it 1 week. She let him absorb that, and relished the minuscule flinch he gave at the end. She smiled. Would you like tea? He took tea only because he did not have to speak while drinking. When he did stop drinking, he decided it was in his best interest to take the lead. If there is to be no rifling, what do you intend to do with me? I intend to talk with you. About what? About you. What makes you, you? About what on earth happened to the smiling, rule-touting Obi-Wan Kenobi that I know, and to Ben, who scares my apprentices and assaults his fellow knights in the dojo. Ben slouched. He was so weary of this perennial fight. Volkara, I will not speak to you about the future. The past, then. Not the one that I know, the one that could be the future. For his sake, Ben, I'm not asking for the horoscope of the galaxy, Volkara burst. I'm asking about you. It's not my job to worry about the galaxy. It never has been. Hell, if I know anything about it. I'm not a politician, I'm not a warrior, I'm a healer. My job, my only job, is to make sure that my patients are whole and healthy, ready to do their jobs. And the council has told me in no uncertain terms that you are neither whole nor healthy. So spare me the lecture. Leave out whatever you like and forget the details of a future which I can only assume was horrible, seeing as you're here at all. Tell me about you. Ben looked away and crossed his arms. Volkara continued to stare him down. At length he said, The trouble with that, of course, is that the future of the galaxy and my own past are virtually one and the same. Some would call that conceit of the first degree, Master Kenobi. Ben scoffed. I would call it damn rotten luck. Volkara leaned back, balancing her notepad carefully on her knee, as precarious as the status quo in this conversation. Ben glanced at the flimsy sheets, trying to spy her notes. They were unintelligible. He squinted at her. You're going to write down what I say? Some of it, yes. In my own personal shorthand, which is as good as gibberish to anyone but myself. I usually transcribe these notes, but given the confidential nature of, well, anything you have to say, I'll leave these au naturel. Unflimsy, out of the official records. She watched his expression. Feel better? Not particularly. Very well, she said, and wrote something down. He craned his neck to see. Now, she hid her notes for show, but her code wasn't even an Arbesh. Behave. Honestly, I thought Qui-Gon would have taught you better manners. Wait a moment. She caught herself. He's Qui-Gon. Never mind. She shook her head and ignored Ben's affronted look. Rest assured, my notes are nothing incriminating. They merely remind me of our conversation and my observations. And what might those be? That you dislike thinking about your past, but it's likely all you can think about. His wince told her that she'd hit the mark. That you are nervous about revealing anything about the future to anyone, that you are wary of just about everything not under your control, and that you have a sharp silver tongue that you're used to getting you out of tight spots. Ben had the presence of mind to blush and look away. He was not happy to admit, "Full marks, Master Che." Okara made a note and watched him silently for several moments, wondering what trials had forged the wrinkles in his brow. At length she decided, "Tell you what, Ben, I'll make a deal with you." His eyes shot up in suspicion. "Tell me one thing, just one thing that I don't know about you or who you were, and I'll let you go early." Ben's face was unreadable. "What kind of thing?" "Anything, no matter how trivial or small. Just one thing that is true about the Obi-Wan Kenobi of yesteryear." Ben sighed and fiddled with his fingers. It was a trap. He knew it was a trap. He'd never trusted healers, but mind healers were a class all on their own. They were the real masters in the horrible order of the halls. They didn't bother with gross matter and bodies. They got into the head and circumvented the wiles that other people usually found so compelling. It was downright insulting. It was a trap. "But maybe," said a far too sensible old desert hermit from the back of his thick skull, "it was about time he was caught." He drew a massive breath and sighed it back out. "Fine." Face not betraying the considerable sense of satisfaction that she felt, Vukara sat back and waited for his confession. "I'm not 35. I may look it, but I've been alive a lot longer than that." "When we met you said that you were an old man." She nodded. "I am," Ben told her. "Older than Qui-Gon, actually, which I might add is a thoroughly odd sensation." Vukara let herself chuckle at the idea. It helped to hide her surprise. This meant that Ben was several years older than her as well. "Really? How old were you when I died?" "Yes." 57, I believe." He scratched his beard. "Or 58. I lost track a bit near the end." "I see." Vukara jotted down a few notes. "Must have been quite the shock to wake up a young man again." It was. Ben found himself laughing despite himself. "Good joints, hair and all. Do you know, I hadn't realized how bad my vision had become before all this happened. I'm afraid I'm doomed to be terribly nearsighted one day." "Oh dear," she laughed with him. "We'll be sure to take care of that when the time comes. Does Master Jin know he ought to be deferring respect to you?" She grinned. "Oh no." Ben laughed at the thought. "Dear Force, no. Age or no, he's... I only ever knew him as my master. He'll stay that way." Ben spoke only fondly, but something in his words made Vukara wonder. "At any rate, I'm sure it would only confuse poor Obi-Wan to wit's end." "A fair point," said the healer. "I suppose you must have garnered enough respect, though, from others." Ben opened his mouth, but stopped. After a brief pause, he said, "I've told you my piece for the day, Vukara. I believe we had an arrangement." The healer shrugged. "Was worth a try. Thank you for indulging my curiosity, Master Kenobi. I'll uphold my end of the bargain." She stood and went to the door. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" They always said that for these kinds of things, Ben thought. Pulling teeth, pricking needles, traumatic surgery. "I suppose not," he said, wondering if he'd regret it later. "I'll send for you again in 2 weeks. Same time, same room." "And what will we do then?" Ben asked, meandering towards the door. "The same as we've just done. I'll make us tea, we'll talk, I will take notes, and you will tell me one thing about yourself that I do not already know." "Until you get what you want." "Until you get what you need, Ben," she told him softly. "You do know that I only have your best interests at heart." He did. That was the problem. "This is going to hurt eventually, isn't it?" Vukara could not tell him one way or another. "If the Force wills it. If it does, it will bring healing with it as well." Pulling teeth came to mind again. "Yes, I suppose," he grumbled, already plotting out the next 9 months' worth of tidbits to feed Vukara to keep her off his trail. She'd draw them out of him regardless. "The Force be with you, Master Kenobi," she told him, folding away her notes into a private pocket. He was striding to the hall exit as quickly as he dared. "And also with you," he mumbled and fled the scene. "Master Kenobi!" A voice chirped from behind. He turned to see Aola charging towards him, juvenile Leku swinging, a precariously balanced cup of muja juice wobbling on a tray. To her credit, it did not fall. "Well, hello there, my archival friend." "What's acrobal?" she asked, not asking for permission as she set her food up on the table across from Ben. "Archival," Femore repeated, having caught up with his apprentice. "It means having to do with the archives. I believe Master Ben thinks you live there now." "Oh, okay." Aola nodded, perfectly happy to accept the assessment. "Padawan, you ought to have asked before sitting down." "Oh," she shrunk slightly. "Yes, Master." Her cheeks blushed a deep violet. "I'm sorry, Master Kenobi. May I sit here?" "Please do." Ben smiled and waved Femur around to sit next to Aola. "I'm starved for company. I've been cooped up reading all day." "Sounds like fun." Aola smiled, making evident her missing teeth. "What are you reading?" "Not the books that you enjoy, I'm sure," Femur chided, tucking into his salad. "Minutes of the Galactic Senate General Sessions ranging back into the last decade," Ben told her. "I'd be more than happy to share. You might find them interesting." It certainly didn't sound like the picture encyclopedias that she enjoyed, the ones with the carnivorous plants and outer rim fauna that had giant teeth and funny eyes. She said, brain stalling. She glanced away, looking for an escape. Her face lit up. "Master," she abandoned Ben's invitation and tugged on Femur's sleeve. "May I go sit with my friends?" She pointed to a table some meters away where a few initiates in the Padawan were eating together. "Manners first, Padawan. Answer Master Kenobi." Aola peered back at Ben, who smiled encouragingly. She sat up straighter and managed a very mature tone. Maybe another time, Master Kenobi. Thank you for offering." "Of course, young one." A pause, just brief enough for Aola to sense that Femur had registered her obedience. "May I go now, Master?" The other children were waving at her. "Yes, but if you want anything for dessert, you have to bring it back over here to eat it. Don't make yourself sick again." "Yes, Master." Aola flew off the bench first and then dashed her tray off the table. Remarkably, her muja juice managed to stay upright for its second perilous journey of the day. "She's awfully flighty." Ben watched her go with a grin. "Sure to be a menace on the dojo," he wagered. "Oh, yes," Femur grinned. "Quite a natural at Ataru. She wants to learn Jakai." "Really?" Ben's eyebrows shot up. "Jakai Ataru?" He cast a look at her, limbs and leku flailing around as she told an animated story to her friends. Imagining a saber in either of her hands made for an interesting show. "And you will let her?" "I've told her we may revisit the idea when she becomes a senior Padawan." Femur chewed his chagrin, which in the moment tasted of leafy vegetables. "Force gives me strength when that day comes. But enough of my troubles. How are you?" "Well enough. Up to this and that. Reading, mostly, as I said." "Yes, you did say. Old Senate meetings. Why on earth have you subjected yourself to such mental drudgery?" Ben shrugged, chewing his sandwich thoughtfully. "I've been away a long time. I had a mission recently that thrust me back into the diplomatic frays of Coruscant. I've realized that I know very little about the goings-on these days, what I've missed while out in the Rim. I thought I'd do some catching up in my free time." "You have more discipline than I," Femur said, taking a drink. "Tell me about this mission of yours. I've been grounded here for Aola's sake for far too long. I'd appreciate a good story or two." Ben shrugged. "Oh, it was a fairly boring assignment." Which was not a lie. The assignment was boring. "A diplomatic squabble." "Hence the Senate records, yes." "Where to?" "Herdessa." "Herdessa? Out near Ryloth?" "Yes, the very same." Femur let down his fork. "You don't mean for the refugee bill, do you?" Ben kept his expression trained. "Mm-hmm." Femur's fork clattered into the bowl. "That was—" He realized he raised his voice. He lowered it again. "That was you?" "What was me?" "I've my connections in the archives, remember? Word has it that whoever led that mission pulled something bad enough to have it all buried beneath red tape. And the 6-month censure to boot." 9 months, actually," Ben grumbled. Femur's eyes widened. "It was you." He sat back, studying Ben in a new light. "Force Ben, what did you do?" "Oh," Ben shrugged, not really wanting to get into it. "This and that." Femur scoffed. "Stars, you sound like Qui-Gon." Ben's eyebrows rose curiously. "I suppose I'll take that as a compliment," he said, taking his turn to study his lunch companion. They chewed, silent in their impasse for a few moments, before Ben ventured, "For not being friends with the man, you mention Master Jin rather often, only because you keep bringing him to mind." "And how do you know him? There's something neither of you are telling me." Femur sighed. "I don't want to get into this, Ben. It's in the past." And that would have been that, but the negotiator found himself in possession of a superior hand of cards. "Tell you what," he played his gambit. "You tell me how you and Qui-Gon really know each other, and I'll tell you what happened on Herdessa." Femur stared him down, trying to keep his face trained and still. It was not every day that one was offered eyewitness intel on clearance level 1 information. Then again, he'd have to pay for it, but Ben seemed the trustworthy sort. If he hadn't been so compassionate, if he hadn't been so open about his friendship with Qui-Gon, Femur wouldn't have bothered. But Ben obviously cared. And anyway, Femur hadn't been out in the field for a long time. Living vicariously was his only way out of the temple these days. He sighed. "You first." Ben smiled. He launched into his tale with only slight hesitation, recounting the mission with as much detail as he dared. True to his word, he told Femur of everything that had happened on Herdessa. Tatooine did not enter the picture, and neither did Anakin, nor Gardula, nor the bet, nor the 22,000 Twi'lek, and thank the Force Aola was not here to make him feel even guiltier about it. Still, truncated as it was, the tale did not disappoint Ben's action-starved audience. By the time he had finished, Femur was staring gape-mouthed from across the table, equal parts awe and utter horror written all over his face. Wait, I'm sorry," Femur laughed. "You sabotaged it during your lunch break?" "Well, we were quite pressed for time," Ben defended. "We?" "Yes, it was a joint mission. Between you and... I don't think I ought to say. I shouldn't have told you any of this anyhow. It would tempt the Council with expulsion to know that I did." He let the subject die and allowed Femur a last chuckle at his expense. "In any case, you know all about joint missions, of course." He sipped at his drink and eyed Femur expectantly. The other master sighed. "Fair enough. It's nothing as exciting as sabotage and crashing star carriers, I'm afraid. It's all fairly simple." He shifted into a more comfortable spot and swirled his drink, watching the mesmeric circles it made rather than looking at Ben. "When I was a Padawan, I trained under a master by the name of Shinal. She was strict, but very knowledgeable. I learned much at her hand, but never enough to face the trials. As the Force willed, she was killed while on a solo mission. I was still at the temple. I suppose I expected the Council to forward me to my trials, but Master Yoda believed I needed more training." He looked up at Ben. "Master Jin took me on as an apprentice until I was knighted." Ben's brow shot upwards, and there was no words to convey his shock. It took him a moment to say, "You were Qui-Gon's apprentice?" Ben asked incredulously, mind awash in the implications of the revelation. "His first, in fact. He only trained me for 3 years until I graduated, but it earned him his masterhood." Femur's mouth twitched in a far-gone smile. It was odd, being assigned to an inexperienced teacher as a senior Padawan. But Master Jin and I became good friends. Master Shinal taught me how to be a good Jedi, but in some ways, Qui-Gon was the one who taught me how to be a good man. I'm grateful that the Council kept me from the trials long enough to train with them. It was something Ben was perfectly prepared to imagine of his old master. But in this instance, something happened, Ben guessed. Femur nodded. "I was Qui-Gon's first apprentice, but..." Femur shrugged and turned his attention back to his drink. "He does not see it that way." "How do you mean?" Ben's senses wavered in uncertainty. He could feel something coming, something unpleasant that part of him would rather leave untouched. He brushed the feeling aside and pressed on. "You've been in the Outer Rim for a while. You weren't around to have seen it all, but you might have heard of a young man by the name of Xanatos?" Ben's heart was beginning to sink. "I have. The fallen apprentice?" "Yes, Qui-Gon's second apprentice, technically. But after Xanatos happened, Qui-Gon discredited my apprenticeship." "He what?" Femur shrugged. It hadn't been a formal thing. The Council couldn't have allowed it. It was entirely Qui-Gon being Qui-Gon. He was convinced that Xanatos' fall to the dark was his fault, and there was something intrinsic to him and his teachings that pushed him towards the dark. He renounced his successes with me to validate his own suspicions. I believe he refers to Xanatos as his first apprentice now. Ben's right hand was a twitching fist at his side. His eyes were wide, though he was too wrapped up in his own thoughts to notice his own expression. Just like that? Because of some upstart boy come into the picture? I don't wish to paint Master Jin in an unduly dim light, Ben, Femur disclaimed, eyes sad. But, yes. Ben swallowed stiffly. A rift opened in his heart, a stitch that he'd always tried to ignore for Anakin's sake. It leaked memories he'd nearly forgotten. A council meeting at night, a disowning look, a feeling of abandonment, a rush of anger towards the only father he'd ever known. I'm sorry to hear that, Ben said with a depth of sympathy Femur would never understand. As I said, Master Ben, the resolution in his voice was genuine, but it was devoid of any smile or good spirit. It's all in the past. Of course. It was all in the past, and potentially the future. But Anakin was on Alderaan. It couldn't happen the same way twice, and yet... Ben clenched his fists again, head spinning with the knowledge that he'd had a brother in his lineage all this time, a potential support that he'd never been allowed to know. He was the third, not the second apprentice. He was the second, not the first one who Qui-Gon had left on the wayside. He would be the last, Force help him. Breaking into Ben's reverie, Femur spoke up to excuse himself to collect Ayola, before she lets them drag her into trouble again, and wished the Force to be with him. Ben reprocreated numbly, a vein throbbing hotly by his temple as he tried to comprehend his own emotional state. It had all been buried so long beneath the rubble of war, the sands of Tatooine. How could it feel so raw? But he hadn't lived by the Jedi Code when he'd stifled those memories, not by the old code. Perhaps he'd never relinquished those feelings after all. Perhaps they were still here by the will of the Force to prompt him. He was here to change things, was he not? Qui-Gon was a stubborn man, and change would not come easily, but Ben knew him inside and out. A vapid-like fury was boiling in his gut, hot and rarefied into a tool of rebuke. Qui-Gon was like his father. His father had hidden the fact that he'd had an older brother, disowned for sake of the father's pride. Disowned like he would be, one day, for an inverse ambition. Circumstances had changed, but Qui-Gon would not. Not unless something forced him to, and the Force was with him. Ben would not allow Obi-Wan to suffer his sibling's fate. Ben would be Qui-Gon's last failure, so help him. After wiping his mouth and returning his dishes to the serving droids, Ben left the refectory and headed straight for the residential wing. He could have walked the path to the Jin Kenobi residence in his sleep.